The first thing they noticed about Captain Roderick Rook Matheson was how small he seemed. Among the towering figures of the training camp, with their glistening scales, armored exoskeletons, and bristling fur, Rook looked like a fragile relic. His uniform, though crisp and neatly pressed, did little to conceal his unimposing frame. His stride was calm, measured, and indifferent to the murmurs that rippled through the alien soldiers gathered to watch his arrival. Karath stood in the back of the group, his long tail flicking in irritation. He had heard stories about humans before, about how they hailed from a world of constant upheaval, a Deathworld, as the academics called it. Yet, as he watched the humans step off the transport, Karath couldn't help but scoff. This was the infamous Deathworlder. This pale-skinned creature, barely taller than a juvenile of Karath's own species. A hiss from his left broke his thoughts. "They call that a soldier?" sneered Darvok, a hulking Koran with a maw full of jagged teeth. "I've seen prey animals with more muscle." Karath glanced at Rook again. The human paused in the middle of the courtyard, his sharp eyes scanning the crowd. There was no fear in his gaze, no hesitation. Karath didn't like it. "Enough chatter!" barked Sergeant Varzan, stepping forward. The squad leader's towering presence silenced the group immediately. His crimson scales caught the sun, glinting like polished armor as he gestured for Rook to approach. Rook's boots crunched on the gravel as he strode forward. He stopped a few paces from Varzan, standing at ease with his hands clasped behind his back. "You must be the infamous Captain Matheson," Varzan said, his voice dripping with skepticism. "Welcome to Camp Dracor. I trust the journey here was not too taxing." Rook raised an eyebrow but said nothing. The silence stretched, thick with tension. "Taxing?" Rook finally said, his voice calm and low. "No, just long enough to wonder why I bothered." A ripple of laughter swept through the crowd, but it wasn't friendly. Varzan's lip curled in disdain. "You're here because your people insist we learn from you. The galaxy's great Deathworlders, they call you. Let's see if you live up to the name." The training ground was a harsh expanse of broken rock and alien flora, with jagged cliffs looming in the distance. The sky above was a swirling mix of green and gold, the air heavy with humidity that clung to Rook's skin like a second uniform. "Today's exercise is simple," Varzan announced, addressing the assembled squad. "Survive." Darvok's laughter boomed. "Survive what?" Varzan's grin was predatory. "You'll find out." The group was split into teams and assigned to different zones of the training grounds. Karath found himself paired with Darvok and two others, while Rook was assigned to a team of 4 alien recruits who looked none too pleased about it. As the groups dispersed, Karath couldn't help but keep an eye on the human. Rook moved with an easy confidence. His movements were fluid, precise. When his own team grumbled about his presence, he merely smirked and shouldered his pack. "He's going to get them killed," Darvok muttered as they trekked toward their assigned zone. But Karath wasn't so sure. The exercise started with a bang. Literally. Explosions erupted across the training grounds as automated turrets sprang to life, spewing energy bolts and plasma charges. The soldiers scattered, diving for cover behind rocks and shallow trenches. Rook's team immediately fell into chaos. One of his teammates, a Life Yalan, shrieked as a turret swiveled toward them. "Stay low!" Rook barked, his voice cutting through the panic like a blade. The Yalan froze, their wide eyes fixed on the human. Rook didn't wait. He grabbed the alien by the arm and yanked them down behind a cluster of boulders. "Listen up," Rook said, his tone brisk but steady. "We're not outrunning those turrets. We outthink them. Lay down cover and fire while I move to the flank." The aliens exchanged uncertain glances, but something in Rook's demeanor compelled them to obey. As the Yalan and another teammate opened fire, Rook darted out, his small figure weaving through the chaos with an agility that belied his earlier nonchalance. From his vantage point, Ka-Rath watched in disbelief as Rook reached a turret's blind spot. The human moved quickly, dismantling its power supply with deft precision. "Did you see that?" one of his teammates whispered. Darvok snorted. "Lucky." But Ka-Rath's earlier uncertainty only grew. That evening, the recruits gathered around the fire pits to rest and debrief. The air was thick with the scent of roasting meat and the hum of low conversation. Rook sat apart from the others, methodically cleaning his gear. "Oi, Deathworlder!" Darvok's voice rang out, drawing the group's attention. The Koran stomped over, a sneer plastered across his face. "That was quite the performance today. Tell me, do all humans play with toys, or is that just you?" Rook didn't look up. "Toys?" "The turrets," Darvok said, his voice dripping with mockery. "You didn't even fight, you just tinkered. Where's the warrior spirit in that?" Rook set his gear aside and stood, his movements slow and deliberate. He was half Darvok's size, but there was something in his stance that made Ka-Rath's scales prickle. "You want a story?" Rook said, his voice low. "Fine. Let me tell you about Vega 13. The firelight cast flickering shadows as Rook began to speak. His voice was calm, but carried an undercurrent of steel. Vega 13 was a volcanic world, beautiful in its own way. Rivers of molten rock, skies choked with ash. We were there on a recon mission. Small team, just 6 of us. Simple in and out, or so we thought. The alien recruits leaned in, their skepticism momentarily forgotten. "The first eruption caught us off guard," Rook continued, his gaze distant. "The ground split open, and half the team was gone in an instant. We were miles from the extraction point. No comms, no backup, just us and the planet." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "We moved at night, using the glow of the lava flows for light. The air was so thick with ash you could feel it in your lungs. One wrong step and you'd sink into the ground, or your body would be swallowed by flame." Ka-Rath's tail flicked involuntarily. He could almost feel the oppressive heat, smell the acrid tang of sulfur. "How did you survive?" someone whispered. Rook's lips twitched into a faint smile. "By thinking like the enemy. It's much like fighting an occupying force, except we were fighting the planet itself. Every move had to be calculated. Every decision could mean life or death. And when we finally reached the extraction point..." He trailed off, his eyes hardening. "Let's just say the planet wasn't done with us yet." The silence was deafening. Even Darvok, who had begun the night with taunts, was silent. Rook leaned back, his expression unreadable. "Survival isn't about strength. It's about adaptability. You don't really fight a world. You outlast it." Later that night, Ka-Rath lay awake, staring at the alien constellations above. Rook's story played over and over in his mind. He had always thought of strength as something tangible. Muscles, weapons, brute force, but the human had alluded to something different. For the first time, Ka-Rath wondered if there was more to strength than he had ever imagined. The next morning dawned under a burnt orange sky, the humid air heavy with the scent of metallic dust. Camp Dracour was alive with activity as alien soldiers prepared for the day's training exercises. Despite the grueling schedule, there was an unspoken tension in the air, a ripple of curiosity sparked by Captain Roderick Rook Matheson's presence. Rook stood apart from the bustle, adjusting the straps of his pack with an ease that belied the skepticism surrounding him. The previous night's tale had silenced some of his detractors, but only temporarily. Ka-Rath lingered on the edge of the training grounds, watching as the human stretched and checked his equipment. Despite himself, he found his gaze drawn to Rook's deliberate movements. The human lacked the towering bulk of the Korin or the sinewy speed of the Yalan, yet there was something about him, something Ka-Rath couldn't quite put into words.
"Today's exercise,"
Sergeant Varzan announced, his booming voice cutting through the morning haze,
"is a test of endurance and adaptability. You'll navigate the labyrinth, retrieve the objective, and return to base. Timing is critical, as is teamwork. Any questions?"
The soldiers exchanged glances, but remained silent.
"Good,"
Varzan said, baring his sharp teeth in a grin.
"Move out!"
The labyrinth was a sprawling maze of jagged rock formations and treacherous terrain, designed to test both physical prowess and mental acuity. The air was thick with the hum of drones that patrolled the area, their sensors sweeping for any sign of movement. Ka-Rath found himself paired with Darvok and two others, while Rook was once again assigned to a group of reluctant recruits.
"This should be good,"
Darvok muttered as they watched Rook's team enter the maze.
"Let's see how long the Deathworld lasts."
Ka-Rath said nothing, for he couldn't shake the memory of Rook's story from the night before. Inside the labyrinth, chaos reigned. The sharp turns and narrow passages forced the teams to split and regroup repeatedly. Drones swooped low, emitting shrill alarms whenever they detected movement, forcing soldiers to scramble for cover. Rook moved with a quiet confidence, his sharp eyes scanning the terrain. His team stumbled behind him, their frustration mounting with every misstep.
"Why are we following him?"
one of them grumbled.
"He's going to get us killed."
"Quiet," Rook said, his voice low but firm. "Keep your eyes on the rocks, not the drones." The soldiers hesitated but obeyed. Moments later, a drone swept past, its searchlight slicing through the shadows. The group froze, pressing themselves against the jagged walls. The drone hesitated, its sensors sweeping the area before moving on. Rook exhaled softly.
"It tracks heat signatures. Stay in the shade and you'll throw it off."
One of the soldiers stared at him.
"How did you know that?"
Rook didn't answer. He simply motioned for them to follow. Ka-Rath's team wasn't faring as well. Darvok's brute strength, which often served as an asset, proved a liability in the labyrinth's tight confines. He smashed through obstacles with little regard for subtlety, drawing the attention of the drones.
"Move faster!"
Darvok bellowed as the group scrambled to evade a pursuing drone.
"We are exposed!"
Ka-Rath hissed, his tail lashing in frustration. Darvok snarled.
"Cowards, hide!"
Ka-Rath clenched his fists but said nothing. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was a better way, a way that didn't involve reckless displays of force. By the time Rook's team reached the objective, a small beacon embedded in the rock, they were running on fumes. Yet it was Rook's calm demeanor that kept them going. He studied the beacon for a moment, then gestured for one of the recruits to retrieve it.
"What about the drones?"
the recruit whispered. "Let me worry about that," Rook said. As the recruit worked to free the beacon, Rook rigged a makeshift decoy using his pack and a thermal flare. He placed it a few meters away and activated it. The drone, drawn by the sudden heat signature, veered toward the decoy and away from the group. The recruits stared at Rook in disbelief.
"How did you—"
"Adapt," Rook said simply.
"No, move."
Back at the base, the teams regrouped, their exhaustion evident in every movement. Varzan strode among them, his sharp eyes taking in the state of each group.
"To no one's surprise,"
he announced,
"the Corin team failed to complete the exercise. Again."
Darvok growled, his massive fists clenching. Varzan turned to Rook's team.
"And the humans?"
One of Rook's teammates stepped forward, holding up the beacon.
"We completed the objective."
The murmurs that followed were quieter this time, tinged with a grudging respect. That evening, Karath found himself wandering near the edge of the camp, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. He spotted Rook sitting alone on a rock, the human silhouette framed by the dim light of a distant star. Karath hesitated, then approached.
"Captain Matheson,"
he said, his voice uncertain. Rook glanced up.
"Karath, isn't it?"
Karath nodded. For a moment, he didn't know what to say. Finally, he blurted out.
"Your stories, are they true?"
Rook studied him for a long moment.
"Why do you ask?"
Karath shifted uncomfortably.
"I don't understand how someone like you, someone so fragile, could survive what you've described."
Rook's lips twitched into a faint smile.
"Fragile, huh? Let me tell you about the siege of Olympus Prime."
The fire crackled softly as Rook began his tale.
"Olympus Prime was a fortress world,"
he said, his voice steady.
"Heavily fortified, strategically vital. The enemy wanted it, and they came at us with everything they had. Siege weapons, orbital bombardments, you name it."
Karath listened intently, the vivid imagery painting a picture of chaos and destruction.
"We held out for weeks,"
Rook continued.
"Food and water ran low. Communications were cut. Morale was in the gutter, but we had one advantage."
"What was that?"
Karath asked.
Rook's eyes gleamed. "Ingenuity. When the enemy bombarded our supply lines, we repurposed their own drones to ferry supplies. When they breached our outer defenses, we rigged the rubble with traps. Every time they thought they had us beaten, we adapted. We found a way."
Karath frowned.
"But that's not strength, that's trickery."
Rook chuckled. "Call it what you want.
The fact is, we survived. And in the end, the enemy retreated. Olympus Prime stood. Not because we were the strongest, but because we were the smartest."
Karath sat in silence long after Rook finished his story. For the first time, he felt the foundations of his worldview begin to shift. Strength wasn't just about muscle or firepower. It was about resilience, adaptability, and a will to fight. As he rose to leave, he glanced back at Rook.
"Thank you for the story."
Rook nodded, his expression unreadable.
"Anytime."
The airlock hissed open, revealing the stark blackness of space and the forbidding asteroid belt ahead. Camp Dracor's training routine had been abruptly interrupted by a coded emergency signal. A Confederation supply freighter, the Doraith Prime, had been ambushed by raiders in a nearby sector. The freighter managed to escape, but was critically damaged, its power systems failing. It drifted deep into a treacherous asteroid field, with its crew trapped aboard.
"Standard rescue op,"
Sergeant Varzan had announced, his tone as dry as the camp's recycled air.
Locate the Duraith Prime, stabilize the crew, and extract. Simple enough even for you lot.
Despite his words, everyone knew this was no routine mission. The asteroid field, known as the Razor Drift, was a notorious graveyard. The jagged rocks were riddled with unpredictable gravitational anomalies, and the raiders might still be in the area. Ka-Rath adjusted the straps of his harness, his tail flicking nervously. The team stood in the cramped confines of the transport ship, weapons and tools secured, their breaths shallow with anticipation.
Listen up,
Varzan said, addressing the team.
I'll oversee the mission from the command deck. Captain Matheson, you'll lead the ground unit.
The silence that followed was deafening. Rook, leaning casually against the wall, raised an eyebrow. Me?
Yes, you,
Varzan said, his tone clipped.
Since you're so good at adapting, let's see how far that gets you in the field.
The Duraith Prime was a hulking mass of metal drifting among the jagged asteroids, its hull scorched and pockmarked from the attack. As the team approached in their transport, the ship's lights flickered erratically, casting eerie shadows across its surface.
Docking now, the pilot announced. 5 minutes to go.
Rook stood at the center of the group, his sharp eyes scanning their gear. This isn't a training exercise, he said, his voice calm but firm. Stick to your roles, keep comms clear, and follow my lead. Darvok snorted.
And what makes you think we'll follow you?
Rook didn't flinch. Because I've survived places that make this look like a stroll through a garden, and because if you don't, you'll be dead. Your choice. Ka-Rath suppressed a smirk. For once, Darvok didn't have a comeback. The team entered the freighter through a ruptured airlock, their boots clanging against the metal floor. The air was thick with smoke and the faint tang of burnt wiring. Split into pairs, Rook ordered. We need to locate the crew and stabilize the ship's systems. Ka-Rath found himself paired with Rook, a prospect that filled him with equal parts excitement and dread. As they moved through the dimly lit corridors, Rook's movements were precise, his eyes constantly scanning for threats. What do you see? Rook asked abruptly. Ka-Rath blinked, caught off guard.
What do you mean?
The scorch marks on the walls, the debris patterns, Rook said, gesturing with a gloved hand. What do they tell you? Ka-Rath hesitated, then focused.
The raiders used concentrated plasma charges. They breached the hull here, but didn't advance beyond this corridor.
Good, Rook said with a nod. Why?
They were targeting something specific, probably the main power core.
Rook gave only the faintest hint of a smile that vanished as quickly as the blink of starlight. Exactly. Ka-Rath felt a flicker of pride. For the first time, he began to understand the human's method, thinking beyond the immediate danger, piecing together the bigger picture. The team's progress was interrupted by a sudden, violent tremor. The freighter groaned as an asteroid scraped against its hull, the impact sending them stumbling.
Report!
Rook barked into his comm.
The power core's destabilizing,
came the frantic reply.
We've got maybe 20 minutes before this ship tears itself apart.
Ka-Rath's heart raced. 20 minutes to find the crew, stabilize the core, and get out. Keep moving, Rook said, his voice steady. We're not done yet. They found the crew huddled in the freighter's medical bay, a group of 6, varied species, their faces pale with fear. One of them, the captain, stepped forward.
You've got to get us out of here,
the captain said, his voice trembling.
The core.
We know, Rook interrupted. You'll be safe. Ka-Rath, escort them to the extraction point. I'll handle the core. Ka-Rath hesitated. Karath led the crew through the labyrinthine corridors, his senses on high alert. Every creak and groan of the ship made his scales prickle.
"Almost there,"
he said, glancing over his shoulder. A sudden crash echoed behind them. Karath turned, his heart sinking as 3 raiders emerged from the shadows, their weapons raised.
"Stay back!"
Karath barked, placing himself between the crew and the attackers. The raiders sneered, their predatory eyes gleaming. Karath's mind raced. He could fight, but he was outnumbered and outgunned. Then he remembered Rook's words. Adapt. Think beyond the immediate danger. His eyes darted to the walls, noting the exposed wiring and damaged conduits.
"Get down!"
he shouted to the crew. As the raiders advanced, Karath fired a single shot into the conduit. Sparks erupted, and a burst of energy arced across the corridor, striking the raiders. They collapsed in a heap, stunned but alive. Karath exhaled, his heart pounding. For the first time, he understood the power of ingenuity over brute strength. In the engine room, Rook worked quickly, his hands flying over the control panels. The power core pulsed ominously, its containment field on the verge of collapse.
"Talk to me, Matheson."
Varzan's voice crackled over the comm. "I'm stabilizing the core," Rook replied, his voice calm. "But we've got less than 5 minutes."
"Hurry up,"
Varzan growled. Rook smirked to himself. "No pressure." Karath and the crew reached the extraction point just as the freighter shuddered violently.
"Where's Matheson?"
Varzan demanded, his red eyes blazing. Karath opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, the sound of boots on metal drew their attention. Rook emerged from the corridor, his face smudged with soot, but otherwise unscathed. "Core stable," he said, his tone casual. "Let's get out of here." Back on the transport, the team sat in silence, the weight of the mission settling over them. Rook leaned back in his seat, his expression unreadable. Karath, sitting across from him, felt a surge of respect.
"You saved us,"
Karath said quietly. Rook met his gaze. "No, we saved each other." Karath frowned, but before he could reply, Rook closed his eyes, leaning into the hum of the ship's engines. The Razor Drift was a distant memory by the time the Doraith Prime rescue mission was entered into the logs. Back at Camp Drakor, the mood had shifted. Rook Matheson, the human Deathworlder, was no longer the butt of whispered jokes or disdainful glances. His leadership had saved lives, and the squad's grudging respect was palpable. But the galaxy had a way of testing hard-won lessons. The alarm blared through the camp like a physical blow, cutting through the early morning stillness. Soldiers scrambled from their bunks, their movements jerky with adrenaline. Karath was halfway through strapping on his gear when Varzan's voice boomed over the comms.
"All units to the main hangar! We have incoming!"
Karath exchanged a tense glance with Rook, who had appeared in the doorway. The human's face was calm, his sharp eyes already calculating.
"What now?"
Karath asked, his tail flicking nervously. "Something big," Rook replied. The hangar was a hive of activity. Dozens of alien soldiers gathered around Varzan, who stood before a flickering holographic display. The image showed a massive serpentine ship cutting through the void, a known raider dreadnought bristling with weapons and reinforced plating.
"This is the Kraxul Scourge,"
Varzan began.
"A pirate flagship notorious for laying waste to colonies and leaving no survivors. They've evaded capture for decades, but now they're here, and their sights are set on Camp Drakor."
Murmurs rippled through the crowd.
"They're too powerful,"
someone whispered. They'll tear us apart, another muttered. Varzon slammed a clawed fist onto the table, silencing the murmurs.
We are soldiers of the Confederation. We don't surrender and we don't retreat. This is our home, and we will defend it.
The silence was heavy, and Karath felt a knot of fear tighten in his chest. Rook's voice cut through the tension like a blade. What's their weakness? Varzon hesitated, his eyes narrowing.
What do you mean?
Rook stepped forward, his expression unreadable. Everyone has a weakness. If they're still using that ancient dreadnought, there's something holding it together that we can break. Varzon folded his arms.
And what do you suggest, human?
Rook leaned over the display, studying the schematics. The Scourge's size is its greatest strength, but it's also its greatest vulnerability. Big ship, big blind spots. We exploit those, get inside, and take out their command systems. A ripple of unease swept through the room.
You're suggesting a boarding mission?
Rakath asked, his voice tight. Rook nodded. That's the only way. The plan was audacious. A small team would infiltrate the dreadnought through one of its maintenance ports, disable its navigation systems, and force it into retreat. It was a desperate gamble, but there were no other options for a military camp whose only true naval asset was a small frigate. Rook, Karath, and a handful of others suited up, their faces grim. Remember, Rook said as they boarded the transport, this isn't about brute strength. Stay sharp, adapt, and trust each other. We'll get through this. Karath clenched his fists, Rook's words echoing in his mind. The Kraxul scourge loomed ahead, a jagged monstrosity against the void. The transport ship skimmed along its hull, evading turrets and patrols with hair-raising maneuvers.
Docking in 3,
the pilot announced.
2, 1.
The transport latched onto the maintenance port with a resounding clang.
Move!
Rook barked, leading the charge into the belly of the beast. The inside of the dreadnought was a labyrinth of dimly lit corridors and steaming vents. The air was thick with the metallic tang of ozone, and the walls hummed with the vibration of the ship's engines. Rook led the way, his movements precise and deliberate. The team followed, their nerves taut. Karath, Rook said quietly, what do you see? This time, Karath did not hesitate to answer as he scanned the corridor.
Guards ahead. 2, armed.
Options? Karath's tail twitched.
We can't fight them head-on or we risk immediate detection. Maybe a distraction.
Rook grinned. Good. Make it happen. Karath nodded and darted ahead, his movements silent. He reached a nearby control panel and tampered with the settings. Moments later, a vent erupted in a burst of steam, drawing the guards' attention. Now, Rook said, and the team slipped past unnoticed. The command systems were located deep within the ship, behind layers of security. As they approached the final chamber, the team was intercepted by a squad of heavily armed raiders.
Shit! Hold the line!
Rook shouted, taking cover behind a bulkhead. The corridor erupted in chaos. Blaster fire streaked through the air, and the team returned fire with everything they had. Rakath found himself pinned down, his heart pounding. He glanced at Rook, who was calmly issuing orders despite the chaos.
Rakath!
Rook called.
Do you remember Olympus Prime?
Rakath's mind raced. The story, the traps, the ingenuity. He scanned the corridor and spotted a series of overhead pipes. Taking a deep breath, he aimed his weapon and fired. The pipes ruptured, releasing a torrent of coolant that sprayed across the raiders. The attackers faltered, their movements sluggish as the freezing liquid coated their armor.
Push forward!
Rook commanded, and the team surged ahead. They reached the command systems with seconds to spare. Rook accessed the terminal with haste.
Come on,
he muttered.
Hurry!
Karath urged, glancing back at the approaching reinforcements. The terminal beeped in denial. Rook swore and decided to just shoot it until it lit on fire. The ship shuddered violently as its navigation systems went offline, almost immediately swerving and crashing into one of the smaller escort vessels, which then exploded violently. The lights flickered and alarms blared.
Time to go!
Rook shouted. The team sprinted back to the transport, the corridors collapsing around them as the dreadnought's systems failed. They boarded the ship just as the now wreckage of the Kraxul Scourge began to listlessly drift, its weapons falling silent. The transport sped away, leaving the crippled dreadnought behind. Back at Camp Drakor, the team was met with cheers and applause. They had accomplished the impossible, and the Kraxul Scourge would no longer terrorize the galaxy. Rook stood apart from the celebration, his expression calm but satisfied. Karath approached him, his tail swishing with excitement.
You were right, he said. Strength isn't just about power. It's about adapting, thinking ahead.
Rook smiled faintly. And trusting your team. Karath nodded, his respect for the human now absolute. As the stars stretched out above Camp Drakor, Karath realized he was no longer the same warrior who had doubted the Deathworlder. He had learned to see strength in a new light, a strength that came not from brute force, but from resilience, ingenuity, and unity. And for that, he had Rook Matheson to thank.